we have a population that unfortunately has normalized racism. And I don't think they're to blame for that. I don't think that people are born racist. I don't think that people are naturally hateful towards other people. I think we've created the conditions in this country for racism to arise such that, that people that widespread racist views are quite normalized. And we see that, 58% of people, according to YouGov, have sympathy for those who peacefully took part in the demonstrations triggered by the Southport murders. There is a spectrum of opinion here. Okay, only 7% of people actually support the unrest, but quite a large proportion are like, yeah, fair enough, they were pissed off. So I think we need to take that really seriously and not indulge people's racist views and anti-immigration views, but try and think about why they are held. And I think shutting them out of left-wing movements is wrong.
Hello and welcome to Downstream. Just to say right away, we're filming this on Friday the 9th of August. So hopefully by the time you're watching it, the racist rioting which has engulfed much of the country will be over and we can dedicate ourselves to repairing the damage that's been wreaked on people's lives, livelihoods and communities. But why did these riots happen? Is it to do with successive governments' immigration policy or is it the fault of social media? Can we explain it through the lens of austerity, deindustrialization, weakening social bonds? Or is there something particular about Englishness and the demographic mix which constitutes it? With me to discuss these issues and more are Rivkah Brown and Bastani. I hope you enjoy the show. So we've got an Iranian Catholic, a Buddhist Jew and a Bengali Muslim, and it's not a setup to a joke. We're all here to discuss the race riots, which have been going on for nearly 2 weeks now. And I suppose my first question is, how has it made you feel witnessing this happening in the country that you live in?
Well, I mean, I'm mostly afraid, not so much for myself as for my friends and neighbours, I guess. I actually have a friend who moved to the UK just a few months ago from Namibia. She's moved to the southwest of England with her husband and family. She doesn't actually know that the riots are taking place. I don't want to be the one to tell her, but I also feel I'm sort of ashamed that people that I know are coming to this country looking to make better lives, and this is the reception that they're getting. I guess I also do feel a grim sense of history repeating itself. Obviously my own family came here escaping persecution from Eastern Europe in both the 19th and 20th centuries. And I do think it's right to call what's happening now pogroms. This is clearly an attack on ethnic minorities, not just a single ethnic minority, but sort of ethnic minorities in this morphing way. So it's slightly different to pogroms in that it's not just Muslims in the same way that it was Jews in the 19th century. But it does feel like this kind of horrible ghostly echo of history. I guess I also feel though that there's this sense of inevitability about it all, that so much of the political establishment feels blindsided, as if it's come out of nowhere, as if it's sort of this cancer that's suddenly grown in the kind of body politic, when actually we've known about this for years and years and years. I remember seeing reports that the police knew that the far right was the fastest growing terrorist threat in the UK. Years ago. And now we're just seeing the fruits of that. So I kind of feel like this has been an accident waiting to happen. Our state has not done enough to prevent it from happening and is now acting shocked that something has happened.
I mean, I guess, Aaron, I wonder how it made you feel, not just as someone who's, half Iranian, but you're raising a mixed heritage child as well. So what was your emotional reaction like?
Well, it's interesting because with my daughter, I mean, she's basically white European, right? She's 3/4 European, which is really interesting for me. Obviously, she has a Persian name. Her parents were born in England. She's born in England. And so for the kinds of people that would like to send me home, I'm almost curious home. I'm born in, Bournemouth. I'm kind of curious as to how they would racialize her and how long this is sort of going to continue for. That's a live question for me. If she chooses to have kids in this country with somebody who's, say, European, of European heritage, etc. In terms of how I felt generally, I felt quite miserable on maybe the Monday, I haven't felt personally threatened, I have to be honest. I think there's obviously, we'll talk about this a lot, there's been a massive regional inflection in all of this. In the South, obviously things have happened, but it's not been anywhere near as bad as parts of the West Midlands, parts of the North East. That said, my wife is a counsellor. She has a counsel colleague who's Nigerian. Her daughter works at Southampton Hospital. She's said there's been multiple accounts of basically racial abuse to black nurses there. So this is, I'm not for one moment suggesting that it hasn't, seeped into Hampshire. Obviously it has. There was a quote unquote protest outside immigration border control at Portsmouth Port, etc. But it's clearly not the same. And I think this is probably something we'll talk about. If you look at what's happened in Middlesbrough, Sunderland, and I'm not for one moment saying everybody there agrees with these things or even a significant minority agree with what's happened there. But it feels very different. Rotherham, to what we're seeing in the southeast. And people like to stick the boot into the southeast of England. But actually, it's one of the most diverse places in the country. And it's one of the most diverse places in Europe. You look at somewhere like Reading, Slough, they have a very similar demographic complexion to somewhere like Birmingham. We just don't talk about it very much, right? So I haven't felt that sort of worried for my safety. Although if somebody lamped me, I would be less surprised than usual. But also I think I was raised with quite a lot of this, so I don't really... I remember, for instance, a family member once, I picked up the phone to a family member on my sort of mother's European side when I was about 6 or 7. And they said, pass the phone to your mother, you little C word.
No.
00 C word.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was tiny. I'm half Iranian. This is obviously just, this is not a word that's in circulation anymore at all. It's from Mouth Garnet, let alone to somebody... who's that young, and this would have been in the 1990s. I mean, even then it was a kind of archaic term, right? And so after the phone call, I said to my mum, what does that mean? And she was furious. So there's a part of me that's just grown up around a lot of this stuff, and that's obviously not to excuse or forgive it, it's disgusting. But at the same time, I feel like I'm acquainted with this. I know it's there. I know it's there. And of course, many people know it's there far more than me. They've been exposed to it far more than me. They've suffered racial harassment and abuse far more than I have. But I think the fact that I'm from a place which was overwhelmingly white growing up, I think maybe I've got a different view on it to somebody who maybe was in a majority-minority place in, say, London or the West Midlands 25 years ago. So it's not that shocking or surprising to me, frankly.
So, I mean, I grew up in London in quite a multicultural area, but because it was Enfield, there was also a fair amount of white flight going on. You would have not a not insignificant minority of people who would do things like vote for the BNP at council elections, including, the family of some of my friends growing up. And I remember when I was a kid, we had these neighbours move in next door who were incredibly racist, and they would put lit cigarettes through the letterbox and piss all around the door because they wanted to see my mum clean it up. But I think the difference between what we've seen in the last 2 weeks and those experiences is that those experiences very much felt like the expression of an individual or a household. It didn't feel like they were part of a community as such, right? It just felt like there are the racists. What has happened in the last 2 weeks, and we'll get into the mechanisms of this, is that even if it didn't feel like it was representative of the entire geographical location, the entire town, the entire region, there was a sense of it being a collective activity. So it's not just that one racist family down the road. It's not just this handful of people. It felt like the expression of something collective. And I think it would be really important to get into it. I think... Can
I also say, by the way, this is what characterizes political violence. Is that it's a moment of collective action. It's an episode of collective action and that's what makes it so potent. So sorry, but that's what we're dealing with. By the way, political violence. When people say protest, political violence, contentious politics is the right term.
I think you're completely right to characterize it as political violence, and the components that go into that are really, really interesting because you've got the organized far right, you've got people that I think were just out for a jolly, you've got this whole range of different motivations and experiences going into it. In terms of the feelings of personal safety, I was in a really weird position because on the one hand, if the far right ever come to Tottenham, they have a death wish, right? They just absolutely have a death wish. Part of me is like, I wish you would.
Yeah.
I wish you would.
I'd love to see it.
See what happens. So in that one respect, very, very safe within the community that I live in, which is so diverse. You've got Caribbeans, you've got Africans, you've got a big Latin American community, got Portuguese, got Filipino, you've got South Asians, you've got, white people. It's very, very, very mixed. Feels very, very safe on that level of not having ethnic antagonism. But on the other, being a hate figure for the far right and having images of me being circulated in far right Telegram groups, I was like, oh shit, like something bad could happen if I was out and about in central London. And that was really weird. It was a really weird way to navigate my own sense of personal safety. But I want to move on a bit, and I want to talk about the Southport tragedy specifically, because those 3 children, BB King, who was aged 6, Elsie Stancombe, who was aged 7, and Alistair Silva Aguiar, aged 9. They were all killed and 10 more children and adults injured. A suspect is in custody, has been charged. Their identity has been released to the media after the judge made an order. And I suppose what I want to ask you both is, what were the mechanisms for turning this particular horrendous set of murders, which have traumatized not just the families of the victims, but I think it's quite right to say have traumatized an entire community. What was the mechanism for turning that into an issue of race and immigration and Islam?
I think there are some interesting parallels here. I don't think it's a one-to-one sort of correlation or equivalence, but I've been thinking about some of the parallels between what happened with this Axel guy who is in custody, as you said, for the stabbings, a 17-year-old guy, and what's been happening at the Olympics with Amin Khalif. He set off I feel like in the same way that he set off, despite being a born in Cardiff guy who was not, as was originally claimed, fresh off a boat from Rwanda and an asylum seeker or a refugee. He created this, and he's not a Muslim either. Actually, it's important.
Well, we don't know.
Oh, I think that I think the police have said that he isn't Muslim. Oh, we can check that. But so as far as we know, he definitely isn't an immigrant. He's not. We don't know that he is a Muslim. But despite this, a kind of moral panic was created around immigration and Islam off the back of his alleged stabbing. And I think in the same way, this Algerian boxer set off a massive moral panic about transgender kind of participation in sporting kind of in sports when she herself wasn't trans. And I think it's for very similar reasons. The right launches on these moments of spectacular violence to generate moral panics, regardless of the actual facts of the case. They just kind of need to as closely resemble the kind of necessary components. She kind of just looked a bit trans, or he kind of just looked a bit foreign, and that will suffice for becoming the kind of launch point, the sort of torch paper for a massive fire about an issue that he himself or she herself doesn't represent. And it's because all that you need is a kind of appropriate figurehead for a moral panic, or for, we don't talk about anti-Islam sentiment, we talk about Islamophobia. Phobias are not rational. They're directed in a kind of amorphous way towards a kind of an appropriate target. In this case, yes, Islamophobia might be motivating a lot of the rioters, but they aren't just targeting Muslims. They're targeting Hindus. They're targeting people who just kind of, as I heard said the other day, are a bit brown. They just have a funny tinge, as Angela Smith would say. And so the actual specifics of the case aren't actually as important as their sort of symbolic value. And I actually don't think that the sort of that's where I don't think disinformation or fact checking has an important role to play. The far right don't care what the actual facts of the case are. They care about how they can use the kind of sort of imagery around it to sort of encourage people's worst fears.
Oh, so just to say that the 17-year-old Axel Ruda Cabana, who's the suspect who has been charged, born in the UK to Rwandan Christian parents, and whose family was very heavily involved in the local church. Now, the reason why I'm just saying, we can't say not Muslim for sure is because, of course, people can convert or revert. Yeah. And I just want to leave that open. But in terms of the precise mechanisms of how this got turned into a story of race, immigration, and Islam, who were the key figures in shaping that story, Aaron, after that, that Monday and the Tuesday immediately after the murders took place?
Well, it's clearly an online phenomenon, right? And it's particularly on Twitter, and it's particularly influencers who've tried to make a name for themselves, having sort of heterodox views on things. Andrew Tate, Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage. Those are all different people with different political views. But for instance, Andrew Tate was the one that was saying, it's this man, and he literally used the words, fresh off the boat. And, I don't think that, I take free speech really seriously. And actually, I think that some of the things that Twitter was doing under the previous ownership weren't necessarily wise. I think you should be able to allow a certain amount of dissent. If somebody says that in the context of a multiple murder, I think they should be deplatformed. There's a live criminal case and you make something up like that, it's false information. If you put that in a newspaper, your paper is going to be, even with Ipso, as toothless as it is, Ipso is going to come after you. If we talk about GB News, there's Ofcom, right? If a GB News presenter says, this person, they're a Muslim, they're, quote, fresh off the boat, they're possibly going to lose their license. I mean, they're certainly going to be punished. That person's probably going to lose their job. Look at Lawrence Fox.
But what difference would it really make? I mean, all you have to do is publish an image of the suspect.
Well, I'll tell you.
And people will make the logical
I'll tell you what difference
themselves.
it makes. It's been the primary transmission mechanism. That's the difference it's made. I don't think we realise. Look at Tommy Robinson. His posts in the last week, 10 days, have had tens of millions of views. Tens of millions of views. Now,
what I'm saying is he doesn't have to lie about that. Even if they hadn't lied about the origins, the ethnic kind of background or the religious background of the suspect, I still feel like the same thing would have happened, even if they just told the truth about who he was. Born to Rwandan parents, is clearly black.
May I jump in here? Because I think I disagree. And the reason why I disagree is this, because yes, people may have still had racist responses to just the information which was put out by police and was confirmed, but leadership really matters. And so when you've got these hybrid political leaders / influencers who have very, very devoted followings, and I think for me, part of the context of these racist riots was that Tommy Robinson had a very well-attended demonstration just a couple of days before the murders. So you had an active far right that were feeling their oats, they were feeling strong, they were feeling powerful. These things combined to be able to not only turn this into a story of race, immigration, and Islam, but for that to have consequences out on the streets. And so that's where things being true or not matters. And that's where the framing of information matters, and also who's saying it. Because if the police came out and said, we have a 17-year-old suspect born in Cardiff, right away, I understand there are reasons why they couldn't, and that's fine. But if that was the first information that people heard, sure, they might see an image of him, but it's really up to hardcore racists to go, oh, he's not from Cardiff, really. He's black, and therefore we should go out and do those things. That is a step of removal, which would have kept some people at home. Whereas when you've got people saying it's definitely an asylum seeker, it's definitely a Muslim, it's definitely a Jordanian Palestinian.
Yeah, you kind of, I see what you mean. I guess you still get the people higher up the food chain, like Matthew Goodwin, who would make the same arguments about integration. They just say his family didn't integrate well enough, and therefore, and so it does become a problem of immigration, even though he's not a first generation immigrant.
There's two separate things here. So there's the quote unquote migrant crisis, there's a small boats crisis, there's the issue of refugees, asylum, etc., which this all was channeled into, which doesn't happen if you say actually they're born in Cardiff. So I agree with you, and I think one of the big differences is that social media angle. Now you might be saying, well, hold on a second, it's really important. You mentioned that Tommy Robinson protest from a few days before those murders had 30,000 people there, right? I've been to EDL protests many times in London. At the high point of the EDL no longer exists. Let's call this continuity EDL. It's very different. Nothing like that. Nothing. The biggest one I went to ever was about 5,000 to 10,000 people on a bank holiday. So, there was no football matches. 5,000 to 10,000. This is 30,000 people. The complexion was very different. older people there, families, etc. Why is that happening? Because you have Tommy Robinson with a quote-unquote journalistic documentary on Twitter with more than 30 million views, because you have him being interviewed by Jordan Peterson, millions of views. Now, again, that's not to say, oh my God, cancel Jordan Peterson, remove his platform, etc. But that is decisively what changed between what we've seen in the last week and a half with, say, the murders in Nottingham, by the way, perpetrated again by a person of colour with significant mental health issues, appalling mass murder. 3 people, I think, were killed. 3 people were killed. And I think the reason why this detonated, for instance, and there were so many lies and mistruths told, which then catalysed this mass political violence across the country, I know we believe in ideology. We believe in the role of political entrepreneurialism from both the left and right. We believe in all of that. But sometimes the libs are right. Sometimes actually, if XYZ wasn't on Twitter, if this wasn't being mainstreamed on this particular platform, the response would have looked quite different. And I don't think we have this kind of response if a handful of accounts aren't on Twitter, personally.
You get the final word on this one, Rivkah.
You have the same problem, which is that people might disagree with unrest at protests and the far right rioting, but they agree with the fundamental issues that the far right are rioting about. And those people don't watch Tommy Robinson's YouTube channel. They don't watch Jordan Peterson's interviews. They read the Daily Mail. They read Matthew Goodwin's newsletter. They read the Guardian. They read the Times. And so I think we have to kind of remember that, like, these protests happen within an ecosystem, and that they're at the sharp end of that ecosystem. And perhaps, yes, some of the kind of violence on the streets wouldn't have happened. And yeah, we are talking about the riots, and perhaps those riots would have been less well attended had it not been for the disinformation and the kind of fanning of the flames by people like Tommy Robinson. However, where would those people have gone? Perhaps into parliamentary far right, like Reform, like, the hard right of the Tory party. And so it's kind of, I don't think it's entirely true that this problem is, I think this problem is capitalized upon by people like Tommy Robinson, but it doesn't exist because of them. Do you know what I mean?
So I suppose I've got a response to that, and then I kind of want to frame what you're saying as a question to put to both of you. But I guess what my response is that I think there is a clear difference between people attacking an asylum hotel, a hotel where asylum seekers are being put up, trying to burn it down and graffitiing "fuck Packies" on it, and being drawn to the parliamentary far right. Now, of course, I think the parliamentary far right can do untold harm to migrants and to people of colour in this country. They can shape policies which make the lives of migrants much worse, that can make it a lot harder for people to come here, and to contribute to a climate of political discourse in which racist violence is more likely to happen. But there is still, nonetheless, a difference between people being impelled towards burning down a business just because it happens to be owned by a Middle Eastern gentleman, and saying, you know what, I'm going to vote Reform rather than Conservative, or join Reform rather than join the Conservatives Party. But I want to put this to you as a question, because the reason why this roundtable is happening at all today is because internally at Novara Media, we were having a debate, and it was a debate that was so good, we wanted to put it on camera. So Michael Walker, who is busy preparing for Novara Live and therefore can't be with us today, he made a point on Twitter, which is that if progressives insist that any and all desire for a lower level of immigration is racist, you're then actually saying the far right do represent the majority of people in this country and do represent the majority of the electorate's desires. It gives them ownership of a mainstream issue, and it gives up a sort of a power that the left and liberals and progressive forces have, which is to say that these people are an unrepresentative minority of the country. So where do you stand on what Michael had to say?
Well, I think he's right to a significant extent. I think he probably said it in the wrong way at the wrong time in the wrong place. But I think there's a worry if all of a sudden you're saying that everybody who thinks that immigration should be lower, everybody who disagrees with open borders is on the far right, because that's the overwhelming majority of the country. And I almost feel like some of the conversation's been quite dated. So if somebody said to me, for instance, immigration's too high 10 years ago, I'd be like, literally, I just don't care. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm completely indifferent. Literally, like, it's fine. Immigration is, even if I'm not even going to say it's good. It's like it's net neutral. It can be good. There can be particular downsides if the politics surrounding the issue aren't, right. But I don't buy it's a major issue for the country. Look at the economy, look at the NHS, et cetera, kind of classic economistic left-wing argument. What we've seen though, I think actually in the last 14 years is you've had the Conservatives. Now look at this as a political grievance. Try and put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who's on the centre right. The Conservatives have tried to win votes by saying we're going to reduce immigration. They've said that repeatedly for 14 years. And they have lied and lied and lied. And then you see 1.3 million net immigration under Priti Patel as Home Secretary. Now, I know you guys have
It's lower net. That was gross.
No,
1.3 million.
Net. That was net. That was net immigration. So obviously you have people leaving, you have people coming. But over 2 years, the net increase over 2 years was 1.3 million. It's about 650,000 one year and about 700,000 the next. So it was about 1.3 million net immigration. I can absolutely promise you it was that. And the reality is that for people who voted Conservative multiple times, for that to be happening under Priti Patel, there is obviously going to be a significant political consequence for that. Obviously, when you have net immigration of 700,000 people in 1 year and we're building 150,000 new homes, that is an issue. And I think it's really remiss of the left to say that's not an issue. Now, the left can say one perfectly reasonable answer is to say, we need to build loads more homes. I entirely agree with that. But are you then saying, well, we need to build 700,000 new homes for all the people that are arriving this year when we've got a backlog of maybe 4, 5, 6 million homes we need to build already? And I think there's almost an irresponsibility here by the left not to address that question, actually. Now, my personal view is we're going to have immigration because of very low birth rates. That's the fundamental point here. If you want to build new homes, you're going to have new workers. We're going to have massive labour shortages. We're heading to a birth rate of maybe 1 or lower in the next 10 years. So in the long term, I think the immigration we've seen since 2020 is you probably need that, let alone whether you like it. You probably need that. But at the same time, I can understand where somebody on the right or centre right is coming from, because they were told in 2010 by David Cameron, we're reducing it to the tens of thousands. Actually, it's gone to historic highs. Now, I don't think that means you should go and riot, but I can understand why somebody would say, I'm really disappointed in the ability of the political class and democratic representatives to do what they say they're going to do. I understand that. If we on the left have been voting for a Labour government since 2010 saying we're going to bring stuff into public ownership and they kept on privatising stuff, we'd be angry, right? That shows a complete failure of the political process. And by the way, that's the principal reason why the Tories just got 24%, I think, in a general election. That's why, because they kept on lying to their own voters. So when people say who's to blame for this, is it the migrants, is it the left? No, it's the Conservative Party. They lied on an industrial scale to their own voters for 14 years. Why did they do that? Partly because the economy literally cannot survive without the kinds of immigration that we've seen, particularly post-Brexit. Of course, they can't say that. They can't say that. So I think it's a bit more complicated than maybe some of the left responses.
Just say you were right. That was the figure for net immigration over 2 years. So you were completely right. And hands up when you deserve it, Rivkah.
I mean, isn't it also the case that the Conservatives didn't just lie to their voters because they couldn't actually control immigration because they needed immigration for the workforce, but because there's not the incentive to resolve the problem of immigration isn't just the lack of an incentive to resolve the problem of immigration, let's say, isn't just economic, like we need those people in the workforce. It's also political. We can't have a culture war about immigration if we fix the asylum system.
That's true.
Like, it's very useful to have this problem. It's very useful to keep it ticking along, to have people, this is why Tony Blair dispersed asylum seekers around the country rather than concentrating them in areas where they, are alongside their communities. There are big Ethiopian, Eritrean, migrant communities in parts of London, for example, but these people are in bloody middle of nowhere. So
they're in Colby or something.
Yeah,
right?
They're in places which are notoriously racist. And so, we've created a problem deliberately designed to manufacture a lack of integration. We have one of the only asylum systems in the world that doesn't allow people to work whilst they're claiming asylum. Why would you do that? You not only are you depriving yourself of an enormous potential workforce, you're deliberately refusing people to allow people to integrate, to learn English, to become to join communities, to participate in public life, not just economic life. And so I think, we have to remember that this problem of immigration has been, the culture war is a useful and kind of sometimes quite, it kind of veers between being useful and inconvenient depending on how well politicians tread the line between managing the problem and neglecting the problem. They want to just keep it at that kind of simmering point of bad so that they can continue to point to it as the root of all evil, whilst not allowing it to, what the Tories unfortunately did was allow it to boil over, make outlandish promises about we're going to ship everyone to Rwanda. They just basically got ahead of themselves with like what they were able to, with the kind of fire that they were able to stoke. And then people were like, okay, where's the Rwanda plan then? Like, where is it? And I think, what I think that the way that this question is phrased is maybe a bit misleading, which is, the idea, I don't think it's wrong to say, I think it's correct to say, in fact, that the far right in some ways are representative of the population, and that is a problem. We have a population that has had racist ideas fed to it by both main political parties, by the media, and now where, anti-Islam sentiment is really widespread. We have a 2022 University of Birmingham study which showed that nearly half of Conservative and Leave voters hold conspiratorial views about Sharia no-go areas. This is language exactly drawn from the Daily Mail. We have a population that unfortunately has normalized racism. And I don't think they're to blame for that. I don't think that people are born racists. I don't think that people are naturally hateful towards other people. I think we've created the conditions in this country for racism to arise such that, that people are, that widespread racist views are quite normalized. And we see that, 58% of people, according to YouGov, have sympathy for those who peacefully took part in the demonstrations triggered by the Southport murders. There is a spectrum of opinion here. Okay, only 7% of people actually support the unrest, but quite a large proportion are like, yeah, fair enough, they were pissed off. So I think we need to take that really seriously and not indulge people's racist views and anti-immigration views, but try and think about why they are held. And I think shutting them out of left-wing movements is wrong. Because yes, then we do back ourselves into a corner. We need to drive a wedge between the people who support violent racism and people who have kind of racist views but absolutely do not support violence, and kind of work from there.
Aaron, and then I'm going to jump in.
Yes, a few things. Farage's personal approval ratings with Conservative voters in the last 10 days have fallen by 17 points. And that's because he's being associated with forces of lawlessness. And Conservatives, first and foremost, care about law and order. That's what they care about. And the reason why Farage has been such a phenomenally successful politician, in my view, over the last 25 years, is because he is viewed as a good time guy, jovial, always having a laugh. You'd want to have a pint with him in the pub. He is not associated with hate. He's not associated with disorder. He's not associated really with big P politics. I think that's actually been his genius. And I think this is now a real challenge for him. I know we'll talk about that more in a moment. In terms of the UK and racism, Britain is actually one of the best countries in Europe in terms of, would you be willing to live next door to somebody of a different racial background to yourself? Would you be willing for your children to marry into a family of a different race? We know we've got really robust data on that. So my view is Britain's one of the least racist countries in Europe. I mean, somebody might say, that's not that hard. There's loads of racism in Europe.
Right? We're really grading on a curve.
No, exactly. No. Is it really a surprise that, people are happier for their daughter or son to marry into a Afro-Caribbean family than is the case in Bulgaria, for instance, where there's obviously far greater racial homogeneity? I mean, that's quite obvious, actually. But in any case, Britain performs quite well on that count. So I think Britain is pretty good. Sometimes with statistics, I'm reticent with them. So I saw that one. It's a very powerful one, and I'm not discounting it.
Which one?
The one you're saying
58%
about
58%.
So there's support for the grievances, but not how they're being expressed would be the short formulation.
Yes,
there, right?
exactly. Yeah.
And I think, look, lots of people think, well, 3 kids were murdered. Of course, it's legitimate to protest against that. That'll be some. There'll be some that are saying, well, the way that asylum policy in this country is being conducted is a complete mess. Of course, it's right to protest against it. And I think we probably agree. Yes, the whole system is a mess. They should be able to work, for instance. It's completely inhumane. Mass dispersal is a complete historic failure. I think it is outrageous that, say, a tiny area, which is 97% white, has 400 people from Afghanistan and Iran dumped there. I agree with you. It's really
designed
stupid.
to wind people
up.
It's designed to divide people.
Yeah, it's really, really dumb. And so I think, I'm not even going to say the majority of those people you're talking about, but many of the people who are upset about these things and say it's legitimate to protest against them, there'll be some people who you might be able to, vibe with. That I don't think that's necessarily reflective of mass support for the P word, go home, for instance. I think that is, I do, and I might be wrong, I do think that's a very small substrate of of opinion in this country.
I think just to come back to that question which Michael Walker was posing, which is what happens if you say all desire to lower immigration is racist? You give the far right ownership of the issue. Is that, for me, there's a question in there, which is, are concerns about immigration downstream from racism, or is racism downstream from concerns about immigration? And the fact is that it's probably a bit of both. And looking at the specific history of racism and immigration policy in this country, they're really, really linked. So we've never had a completely de-racialized conversation about immigration where it's just about numbers and the needs of the labour market. Because if we were just talking about the needs of the labour market, then we could talk about, okay, well, we have got an ageing population, but the problem is that if you just bring in foreign labour, we're not training up enough of our own. We're actually going to have a less educated workforce, less good educational institutions. We could have a conversation about us contributing to the brain drain of other countries. We could have a conversation about, I guess, things like in those small sectors where immigration does depress wages, right? And these are small and limited sectors. It's not nearly as big as the far right like to claim it is. Well, what can you do about it? Because then if you broaden it out and you say, well, we're not just talking about culture and demographic complexion, we're just looking at it in terms of the labour market, you go, all right, well, is our solution to turn off the immigration tap? Or is it to say we're going to have sectoral bargaining? So we're going to have fair pay agreements in agriculture or in the care sector or in construction or whatever. Yeah. It becomes a completely different conversation. The problem is that that's never been the one that we've had in this country.
No. Yeah. Sorry.
And I think the sort of the other thing that I would like to sort of draw attention to is that I think you're right. I think that the attitude of not just the Conservative government, but also the new Labour government of 1997 to 2010 was to keep the pot simmering at just the right level. The problem is that immigration policy is made up of lots of different components. Immigration policy is made up of a discursive component. How do we talk about, how do we frame this issue? And the establishment is all in one voice there. Immigration is bad, there's too much of it. Asylum seekers are bad, there's too many of them. Immigration policy is also made up of how many people are coming. And the answer there is simple. The number just keeps going up. So you've got this huge contradiction between what people are saying and what's happening. And then you've got a third component, which is what are the lives like of immigrants and asylum seekers in this country? The fact is that we've tried to make it across the board nastier, more hostile, and worse. We say, okay, no recourse to public funds. We say policy of dispersal, which means that you're far away from whatever community and kinship ties you might have in this country. We say that if you're a migrant and you're coming here to work, you've got to pay a surcharge on your visa to access the NHS, even when you can legally do so, right? All of these things where we say we're going to make your life as immigrants worse. So there are three things which are not in alignment there, right? The discourse, the numbers, and the conditions.
And also, look, this is really key because Nigel Farage is such a canny political operator. Sometimes you forget to just call, and also you might call him out on something which is more emotive rather than the inconsistencies of what he said. Nigel Farage in 2016 said, we can leave the European Union so that we can have more people come over from the Indian subcontinent and from the West Indies and with historic ties to the Commonwealth, and they can come here and do...
And that's what happened.
That's what happened. And then you've got people saying, the P word, go home, right? And you're seeing, and I think it was Hartlepool, just some random South Asian guy just being punched in the chest, probably, arrived in the last several years, post-Brexit, to make up for labour shortages. And I think that's the first point. Secondly, if you're trying to think of what's a sensible, given the crises we're talking about, low growth, high inequality, low innovation, aging population, climate change, if you're trying to be a sensible European centre-right style politician, like the Les Républicains before they went insane in the 90s, I'm trying to think like Jacques Chirac, right? Yeah. I'm trying to think like a sensible centre, or Ted Heath. You're probably thinking, well, look, there's 1 billion people out there in this world from countries with higher PISA scores than our kids, and from countries with a decent rule of law. We should get those guys. There's 1 billion of them. But the centre-right doesn't think like that in this country. Like, it's completely insane. The centre-right, and it's often why I feel so frustrated debating policy with these people, they try to make life so shit for people born in this country that they emigrate, and we're having now big outflows of healthcare workers, teachers, engineering talent. And at the same time, they don't think productively about immigration. So I think that's a really important point, is that there's no switch to make any of this much easier, but I think getting immigration out of the Home Office, actually I'd scrap the Home Office, it's completely dysfunctional. And I think having immigration within a Ministry of Labour would make life so much better and policy so much more coherent. And then thirdly, there's foreign policy. The leading countries, if you look at the small boats crisis, the leading countries of people getting on those small boats, of undocumented migrants to the UK, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan. You might have others in there occasionally, but those are the 4 leading countries. Like, there's a pattern here, guys. You can't have permanent war in West Asia. You can't, and then not expect tens of millions to come to Europe. It's not going to happen. And I find it incredible that you have people on the right like Tommy Robinson saying, yeah, get 2.5 million people out of Gaza. They can go live in Egypt. What if Egypt becomes a failed state? You stupid bastard. It's 100. No, but seriously, it's 100. This can really happen in our lifetime. Is Egypt and Iran becoming failed states? Both circa 100 million people, many of whom would have to come to Europe because that's where the opportunities are. That's where life is going to be better for them, more tolerable for them. Why on earth is the European right so intent on creating as many failed states in West Asia as possible? And at the same time, they say, well, people are coming here. Why are they coming here? It's outlandish to me. And here's the thing. In terms of the people you're saying that might support these riots if they were just protests, I think many of those people would agree. And so it's one of those things where, look, you're not gonna get agreement with lots of people on different things, but you say, look, and this has not been explained to them coherently because our media is an absolute clusterfuck in this country. The reason why we have lots of Iranians and Iraqis and Syrians and Afghans coming here is not only do we not allow these countries to economically develop because of global trade order, we're literally trying to turn them all into failed states. What do you think is going to happen? That's before you talk about Gaza, Egypt, Yemen. And there are some people, neocons, who are like, we want Russia to be a failed state. We need to dismantle, let's balkanize Russia, let's balkanize China. Where do you think those people are going to go? Like, it's insanity, and it's taken seriously amongst policy circles in this country. And like, that's one thing the left can absolutely do, is actually be the voice of common sense on this.
I want to move us along just a little bit, and let's talk about the demographics of the people who are involved in the racist violence specifically. Were there any surprises for you? Because when I was watching the footage coming out of Middlesbrough and I was seeing teenagers going along a residential street, kicking in doors, smashing up windows, I was really quite shocked. And then I had to think about it, and then I kind of came to some conclusions which might be the same as yours, they might be different. But did that surprise you? You know, does the fact that it was teenagers getting involved in racist acts of violence, does that challenge the generation left thesis a bit?
I think the generation left thesis is already a little bit debunked by the last election, where you have quite considerable numbers of young people voting for reform, more than voted for the Conservative Party. We just know that the far right has a monopoly on social media. It knows how to reach people. The kind of populist rhetoric of people like Andrew Tate, of people like Jordan Peterson, it sucks in particularly disaffected young men and gives them a sort of purpose in life. I mean, that's their entire target audience. It's not 60-year-olds reading the Daily Express. Like, those people are already converts. Like, it's trying to catch those young people who have no, who are finding their standards of living drastically worse than their parents, than their grandparents, who see no future for themselves in the UK, no prospects of home ownership, no prospects of earning, of kind of improving their earnings, have been kind of sucked into, often through, as you say, social media channels, YouTube and Twitter, sucked into these discourses that give them kind of colourful, convincing answers to their problems. I think, what's Jordan Peterson's book called? Like 8 Rules for Living Your Life. Like, these are so kind of juicy, appealing kind of formulas for disaffected young people. So I'm not at all surprised. And I mean, I think when we talk specifically about riots, I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to see a disproportionate number of younger people.
It's a young man's game.
It's a young man's game. You don't see 60-year-old, you know, like even the most right-wing 60-year-olds, I'm sure, are a little bit nervous about their, like, you know, their replacement hip.
There was one 70-year-old who was arrested for rioting. And
them.
I think the judge in sentencing was saying, well, you really should have considered your old age before you did it. Because I think in mitigating, he was like, but I'm old, you can't send me to prison. He was like, you should have thought about that before you rioted.
Yeah, thought about those, like, knees, exactly. And so I think, yeah, there's an inevitable skew towards younger people, but I think there's also something about, you know, an outburst of kind of rage amongst, like, particularly young men. And that's in response not just to, you know, right-wing kind of courtship, but also, like, a lack of answers being provided on the left, like a perception of, and also the cultivation of a kind of, like, identity politics. I mean, we can talk about this as well, and how, like, neoliberal identity politics, like, feeds a kind of victim mentality that all people from right to left want to kind of find their raison d'etre in victimhood, and like, you know, what about white people? What about, like, you know, us? Insert your identity category here. I think that also has a role to play. But yeah, I'm not surprised.
What did you think when you were seeing teenagers involved?
Well, my sort of meta hypothesis here is that youth movements no longer matter. We are primed to think in the West since the 1960s, youth movements, they will change the world. No, they won't, because they don't have the demographic weight they used to have, right? You now have in places like Italy, you know, you have just as many pensioners as you have people under 15. Whereas, you know, the immediate post-war period, you have dozens of teenagers for every person over the age of 60, 65. That's the first point. And so this idea that, well, this X generation is really young in the argument. And by the way, I think generation left hypothesis, I think it has some truth to it, certainly in the UK and the US with women. But even if you think that, even if you buy the hypothesis wholesale, it doesn't matter, because the sheer weight of numbers isn't really in the favor of the young anymore. There are some exceptions. Israel, right? Israel is an incredibly young society. It's almost unique in terms of having a very high rate of fertility while also being very economically developed. And I think that actually explains the radicalism of the political sphere in Israel and its direction. That is what happens when you have a quote-unquote youth movement that actually means something. It means that you get people like, I'm not saying that's a youth movement, but that's the direction of politics in Israel, people like Ben Gvir and whatnot. So that'd be my first answer. And actually, I think the really critical change that we're going to see in Western politics over the next 20 years is millennials becoming the ruling class, which is quite amusing, actually. It's a massive, massive demographic cohort. They're going to start inheriting some of the assets from their parents. And actually in business, in politics, in culture, they are going to be in charge for a really long time. And that, to me, is a more important thing to keep your eye on in terms of the long-term politics of the UK or the US than what a 15 or 16-year-old kid is doing. And also, it's really important to say that, you know, young people do stupid shit all the time. I mean, I did stupid shit when I was young. I'm sure we all did really stupid shit. Young men in particular do really stupid things. They do really, really stupid things.
It's those amygdalas. They're not developed.
They're not developed. And you know, this is another good, we talked about all the bad things of an aging society. One of the good things of an aging society is they are less violent. And younger societies are more prone to violence because young people are more prone to violence. So in terms of the generation left hypothesis, I think actually I think that needs to be refined, because I think there's clearly a massive divergence, particularly in the English-speaking world, between men and women who are young. Clearly, that's very obvious now. So I think, yeah, it does throw a little bit of a spanner into the works of Gen Left. And I also think there's the prism of regional inequality, which I think we'll talk about later on. But the idea that like a young teenager in Middlesbrough or Sunderland or Rotherham is going to be left wing, a young male, why would they be? You know, you have to explain that to me.
I mean, I think I agree with you. And I actually think that the story of regional inequality is really important when you're thinking about why teenagers are doing what they were doing. Some teenagers, right? Of course, most teenagers weren't. The first thing is that 7 out of the 10 most deprived areas in England witnessed rioting over the last 2 weeks. And I think that's really, really significant. I don't know where the other 3 were. Maybe they were in London and that's why.
Cornwall. You know? Probably one of them, actually.
Don't get me started. But I imagine that's why. The second thing is that I think you're right. Young people do stupid shit. And I think that there are some productive comparisons to be made between what we've seen in the last 2 weeks and what happened in Hare Hills last month. Because I think that when you've got stuff on fire and glass shattering, there are a lot of young people who are like, how often do you see that? And I remember being a teenager and you'd like see something like left out in a park or on the street, be like, do you want to smash it up? right? There's sort of like destructive impulse, which I think is important, because I think there's a tendency to map one political meaning onto everything. And I just don't think that's true. I think for a lot of those kids, they were like, I want to smash some shit up. I want to do these things.
Yeah.
I think another thing is that, like, you know, we talk about like, oh, like, you know, where is the left or where is the left? It's like, the fact is that the left mostly lives in cities. There are left-wing people in towns.
All very nice, like wealthy villages, you know, like.
Right? Like that's where we live, right? There are left-wing people with really strong class analysis, really strong anti-racist politics across the country, but where they are most concentrated is in cities. And so when we talk about like, oh, well, why aren't the left like reaching these like young men in like Knowsley who like attacked an asylum centre, or like, you know, in Rotherham or in Middlesbrough, it's like, well, how many of you live there? And I think that there's a sort of, and I'm pointing at myself here when I say this, right? There's a huge amount of self-criticism here, which is we may as well be speaking a different language, right? When we're talking about like the politics of it, or we're talking about immigration or belonging, and even when we're trying to like put a political narrative about who you should really be directing your anger at, you're just sort of speaking a different language. And I always think about the difference between being a vegetarian and a shark. Like sometimes it's like when you're talking about austerity, you're saying, oh no, these are the people you should be really angry at, and like this is who's done it to your community. You just sound like a vegetarian. Whereas like Nigel Farage or Tommy Robinson or whoever else it is that's saying like these are the people who you should hate, or even just the older lad who, you know, who's been to prison a couple of times and is like, yeah, get out here, it's going to be big. They're fucking sharks, right? There is just a difference in mood, in affect, in like how you express yourself, and maybe we can do that, maybe we should do that, but like at the moment we're just not. And I think like one last thing is about how people use language in different settings where they're not heard, and this is actually the right who make this point a lot, which is what people say is socially acceptable in polling and what people do in their own lives, right? Very different. And that's kind of across like every major issue. And the example I'll give is this, which is in my own family, I've got a white step family. And one of my stepbrothers was showing me something on his phone. And I saw, when I wasn't meant to, texts exchanged between him and one of his uncles who's white, which was packy this, wog that, N-word, da-da-da-da-da, like all of those just like really, really horrible, aggressive jokes. I was like, that's how you talk when we're not around. And I think that, you know, there is something to say about integration here, but it's not necessarily, oh, immigrants have to like integrate with like white culture. It's like there are some unintegrated elements of white culture, which is still deeply racist, uses that kind of language, feels itself to be under attack. So it's like, oh, you can't say these things openly anymore, right? It's very resistant and hostile to the idea that you shouldn't say those things, and it explodes. And I think that's a part of what we've seen.
Yeah, I was thinking about how also there's, I think like, I agree that there's an almost categorical difference between the left that's trying to the left that's trying to argue against the riots and the rioters themselves. But I also feel like we have to understand these people as somehow winnable. And that like that we have to talk to them. That like they're not some like categorically different type of people who are just kind of racist and they live in towns and we live in cities. Like there's obviously big working class tradition. Like, I mean, historically there have been like much more kind of left-wing organizing in like regional centers. It's just kind of died. And like I think, you know, we have to see like those people as potential. I don't think basically a lot of those people's ideological commitments to Tommy Robinson actually runs that deep, is what I'm saying. And I think like they're not least because they're quite young and they're sort of like trying to figure out how to make sense.
And also
of their
most
world.
people aren't that ideological.
Most people aren't that ideological. But I think that the fact that these people are taking violent, horrific, direct action to resolve problems that are unaddressed in society could be seen by the left as a way, as people who are willing to take direct action to resolve problems in society, just the wrong problems. And like, were those people to understand the problems that are facing our society in a different way, but had the same amount of anger about them, Like they could be part of Palestine Action. They could blah blah pipeline. I don't believe that peaceful protest is actually going to get the left the goods. We've seen historically that capitalism only concedes to left-wing movements. Well, it often concedes to left-wing movements when its hand is forced. Okay, there might be also peaceful movements kind of alongside that. But I've recently been covering the animal liberation movement. They just went and shut down animal farming, animal testing laboratories. They just went and Palestine Action just go and smash up people's weapons factories. And I think the idea that you shouldn't be angry and you shouldn't take direct action to kind of address social problems is wrong. I don't think that PSC marches very noble, but I don't. What have they achieved actually? What have they achieved?
This is where I agree with you. Comrade, this is why I disagree with you, right? Which is that I don't think you're taking into account the importance of movement ecology, right? The fact is that movements have always existed with a sort of moderate middle and a radical flank. And I think that radical flank is important. But it works in concert with, and also sometimes in tension with, that moderate mass movement. And the problem is that people on the left almost always say it's one or the other.
No, I don't.
But you did just now with PSC.
Okay, yeah. I'm saying in and of themselves, what have they achieved? But
nothing's happening in and of itself, right? And you could flip it back around. You could say, well,
in and of itself,
what's Just Stop Oil achieved, right? Apart from hugely long prison sentences.
Well, for
their main organisers.
New oil and gas licenses is obviously was in the Labour manifesto, and they actually I think should disband at this point because they've kind of achieved. But
I just don't think that would have happened unless they also had this bigger climate movement that was showing out alongside with them. I think radical flank and big moderate middle, they work together. There's tension, but you need both.
Sure. I'm just saying some of those people who are rioting currently, I don't disagree with as in I disagree with their with harming people. I don't disagree with the idea that we're going to need riots at some point to resolve some of the issues, some of the kind of refusal of climate capital to actually divest, to slow down, to degrow. All of this stuff is going to take force at some point. And I think that's in some ways what we can see in the rioters is the potential for people who understand at least that.
Tradstani?
I'm inclined to agree with what you're saying. So if you look at, for instance, people that want to reduce immigration, they can riot all they like. Without the technocrats to do it, you're not going to reduce immigration.
But
right?
we're now they've launched a massive conversation about immigration.
No, but start a conversation. Start a conversation often in politics means impotence. That's often what it means. If you haven't got the technocrats, this is the difference right now between the far right in France and the far right in the UK, right? The far right in France with Georges Bardella, etc. They appreciate you actually need to build up a technocratic basis. You need that movement, that Aggie movement, but you also need parliamentary legislation. You need figures in the media, and you need policy wonks to literally work out how you're going to implement the policy.
Absolutely.
So I agree with you. It's those two flanks. And right now, the problem for the anti-immigrant sort of movement in this country is, yes, you can have riots, you can have the media influencers. They literally don't. Tommy Robinson has no idea how you would reduce immigration to this country without collapsing the economy. Nigel Farage, and I've said this time after time after time, they are lying to their audience so much. You cannot have 1980s style low tax, good growth, low inflation, and low migration. It can't happen. You've got to work out which one you care about the most. I've said this many times. The idea that we can reduce tax and reduce immigration and have high growth, you're talking such nonsense. Even somebody who's very politically sympathetic to that point of view and who's being honest knows that's garbage. It's obviously garbage. Mm. So that's part of the point which you're saying, and I'd want to build on, is that any successful movement, and it's hard for the radical left the contemporary radical left to actually buy, you need technocrats. You need quite boring people with suitcases to oversee quite big policy shifts. A big example is decarbonisation, right? That's going to be the biggest technocratic institutional infrastructural undertaking in human history. You're going to need lots of pointy-headed people with glasses, and who may have worked in another lifetime in PricewaterhouseCoopers. You're going to need those people, and it's interesting because in the 1930s, the quintessential figure of the left. This is something that Ezra Klein says in the US. It's really interesting. The quintessential figure of the left was the city bureaucrat. Right? They were the person who was building the big roads. We don't like those now, but that was in New York, for instance, with Robert Moses, or building social housing in this country, often at municipal level before the Second World War, with in London in particular. Right? That was the quintessential figure of the left. What's been the quintessential figure of the left over the last 30 years? It's the protester, right? Mm-hmm. It's the protester. And that's not to say protest is bad, but I think it gets to your point that you need both, right? And I think that's where the right's falling down. Mm. And then my second point is, hold it, I had to say it. Margaret Rice is racist. It doesn't matter. We'll finish there.
Well, just moving things on a little bit, because I want to talk about the intellectual vanguard of the far right. And here I'm not talking about Tommy Robinson, and I'm not talking about political operators like Farage. I'm thinking about Douglas Murray. I'm thinking about Matt Goodwin, because they've been very interesting. Because while they've said, of course, I condemn violence, what they have also said is, well, this is totally inevitable and it's going to happen more. And actually, it's because you have disparaged and ignored and maligned these people. What did you expect? And I think that there is, in my view, in their refusal to use words like racist or Islamophobic or xenophobic, there is a clear sympathy here. And I think it's sometimes the same way where, you know, the left has to go, oh, no, I think the violence is bad, but like ultimately I think these people are right. I think that the intellectual vanguard of the far right are doing it in this instance as well. And I just want to read you a quote from Douglas Murray. He's talking about the demographic and ethnic change brought by immigration. And what he says is, we've lost control of the streets. If the army will not be sent in, then the public will have to sort this out themselves, and it'll be very brutal. I don't want them to live here. I don't want them here. They came under false pretenses. Is that a mask-off moment, do you think?
I mean, definitely. I mean, you've seen in the past few days there being this kind of cleavage between the sort of really hard edge of this far-right commentariat and the sort of like softer, more acceptable parliamentary or parliamentary adjacent face of it. So, there was this public spat that happened between Tim Montgomery, founder of Unheard, the right-wing website, and also former Times columnist, and Matthew Goodwin, with Tim saying that Matt shouldn't be part of public life. And I think this is like a really interesting and probably quite productive kind of cleavage to like try and deepen, which is to say that like, a group of previously acceptable right-wing figures. Remember, Matt Goodwin is on Moral Maze with you, writes for The Guardian.
He's not on Moral Maze with me as a panelist. He was a witness just this one time.
Okay. Well, so he appears in...
And we have loads of crazies on the Moral Maze.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, well, there you go. But so, I mean, nevertheless, he's an acceptable figure. I mean, we obviously have interviewed him ourselves, but like these people are sort of outing themselves as like being quite significantly more extreme than the kind of mainstream conservatives and potentially beyond the pale. And I think, driving that wedge between, even as we might also be tempted to kind of lump them into the same category as being part of the same Islamophobic ecosystem, I think it could be actually quite productive to encourage that divide between the unacceptable hard right, far right, whether that's Tommy Robinson or Matt Goodwin or whoever, and kind of more mainstream conservatism.
I mean, just picking up on that point and throwing it over to you, Aaron, like, isn't the divide here between, the Douglas Murrays and the Matt Goodwins and other figures on the right basically a difference between ethnic and civic nationalism? Now, on this question, Matt Goodwin's very slippery, so he'll claim to be a civic nationalist, but everything he says lurches into ethnic nationalism. Douglas Murray, I think, is really just an ethnic nationalist. That's my reading of his politics anyway. Whereas there are others, I think, on the hard right who would disagree with on matters of immigration and indeed on culture, but who are sincere in their belief in being civic nationalists. Is that the difference that's emerging on the right?
I think it's a huge difference. And I think, for instance, somebody like Nigel Farage is probably a civic nationalist. I think he wants much lower immigration, but I think he is probably a civic nationalist. And you can tell that purely from his associations. So, for instance, we know that reform, basically Farage, it's not even PLC, it's actually a limited company. Farage, other people involved in that, one of the people is an Iranian. strangely, but it's
your people, man.
I know, very strange. Ben Habib, Deputy Leader of Reform, is half Pakistani. The biggest donor to Reform in the last general election was a guy called Zia Yusuf, who is a Muslim from Sri Lanka. And in his heart of hearts, don't sue me, Mr. Nigel Farage. This is just my view. Probably wants Britain to be majority white forever. Yes. Wants massively reduced immigration. Yes. Probably wants immigration in the tens of thousands. Yes. Wants very few or zero refugees, maybe with the exception of Ukraine and Hong Kong. Even then, I don't actually know, if I'm perfectly honest. But nonetheless, I think that he would say, if you abide by the norms of this country, if you obey the law, I don't really care if you're brown or black, you're British. I believe him. Now, I might be wrong. I believe him. You've got people like, I don't think Douglas Murray thinks that. There are other people on Twitter. There's a really reprehensible man. I'm not even going to say his name. He's talking about mass, quote unquote, repatriation of people of color. I don't think Nigel Farage believes that, for instance. And I think this is a really important difference to make here, right? Because those are the genuine crazies. And the reason why Farage's polling has taken such a hit in the last week amongst Tory voters is because they aren't representative of the country, those crazies, right? Twitter isn't real. Twitter is not real. If you thought
Don't tell me this, Aaron.
If you thought Twitter was real, you'd be, you'd think the whole world was either sort of anime communists or, neo-Nazis talking about Aryan excellence at the Olympics. So Twitter isn't real. And I think Farage has been stung, basically, by thinking, albeit briefly, that quote unquote Twitter is real. So I think this is a big, big difference to make. Now, somebody out there might disagree. They might say that Farage is an ethnic nationalist. Where I think there's clearly something going on is, like you say, this elision between civic and ethnic nationalism. I think it's most obvious with Matt Goodwin. I think Farage does do it sometimes, nowhere near as much as Goodwin. There are other people like Konstantin Kisin, for instance. They do it constantly, and I don't think they realize they're even doing it, actually. Or because it seems so natural to them. And maybe I'm stealing your thunder here, but you spoke with him on the Moral Maze about this. You brought out that inconsistency, and then you have Konstantin saying, "I actually don't think this is a very productive way to be talking about things." He said that on Twitter, and I'm thinking, no, this is exactly the conversation we should be having. Let me know, are you an ethnic nationalist or a civic nationalist? These are hugely important terms, because at least the civic nationalist believes in the possibility of integration. Because you're saying, I care about integration. An ethnic nationalist doesn't believe that's possible, because people, by virtue of their skin color and DNA, are inherently different. So, and by the way, I think this is a really important thing to nail people like Matt Goodwin down on.
I mean, so I do actually want to talk about this, because when we're having this discussion about the white British percentage of the population, it feels like it's happening in a parallel universe, because the white British percentage of the population is 74.4%, all right? The white population of Britain, that's obviously more, because then you're talking about, white immigrants and their descendants. So this is still a very white country. Like it just is. Whereas the way in which Matt Goodwin, I think Konstantin Kisin can be another one, Douglas Murray, they talk about this issue, it's at some point it's going to be majority minority, right, of some kind. Firstly, we don't know how this is all going to play out in terms of birth rates, right? Like, we know that birth rates can fall, maybe. Governments can pursue policies which encourage birth rates back up again, right? Some governments have managed it for certain periods of time. Maybe ours will be. We also don't know if there is just going to be constant levels of mixing at a similar rate, or if it's sort of, plateaus at a certain point, right? There's a degree with people who want to live in mixed communities, others who don't. We'll work that all out. The thing which I am constantly coming back to is, well, what do you think the essential difference is between people? And I think that this makes me different, obviously, from the ethnic nationalists of the far right, but I think it also makes me different from some anti-racists on the left, which is, I don't think people are that different. I think people's experiences are profoundly different, right? But race does not come from within me. It is not something which is mine and that I project outwards. Race is imposed on me from the outside. The experience of racism makes me profoundly different from people around me who don't have that experience. But when it comes to other things, religion, language, food, habits. What we've seen is that can change rapidly within a single generation. You know, my grandmother was born a Hindu. She married a Muslim. She then separated from a Muslim, raised a Muslim child, i.e. my mum, who married and divorced another Hindu. And then we end up with me. What's happened in terms of, you know, cultural affinity has changed massively in terms of from where, you know, things started out with my grandma being born to like where we are now culturally as a family. I don't speak Bengali. I didn't get taught it, right? Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing and you shouldn't teach your kids like the language of their heritage. I'm saying that this idea that people's expression of their ethnic heritage remains the same down the generations is complete hooey, right? It's complete and utter nonsense.
But I think this is also where you know, the ethnic nationalists meet the civic nationalists, which is that, you know, we have this emphasis as in like when it kind of suits them, their ethnic nationalists, when it suits them, their civic nationalists. And I think, you know, people like Tories like Michael Gove, who you would think might be kind of you know, more concerned about immigration from a sort of civic nationalist point of view, want there to be, what you know, have implemented in the UK this kind of, you know, a curriculum of encouraging British values. Now, what are those? And like, who gets to determine what those are? And like, does one embody British values simply by being white? I mean, it feels kind of, I feel like, you know, racial anxieties are often triggered in response, not to actual differences in values, but just to kind of much more superficial things like the kind of food people eat or the things people wear. Those aren't differences in values. Those are just differences in culture, which is often like, you know, I share much more in terms of kind of, in terms of my values and my kind of understanding of the value of, for example, immigration and what it's like to be in, and also the experience of being in a diaspora with someone from, you know, descendant of Caribbean immigrants than I do with like a white British person whose family has been here for many generations and doesn't see the value of, you know, and doesn't understand what it's like to have had kind of flows of migration. So I think, yeah, the kind of, I feel like, you know, there's this kind of tricksiness and slipperiness where sort of nationalists like move the goalposts from being about kind of race to purely immigration status to things like values in order to be able to sort of, you know, I guess like wind people up in just the right ways.
What do you reckon?
So I'm going to upset, and it's time. I'm going to upset some people on the left here. You know, I have no issue with if somebody says, you know, we need to teach British values. I often think it's a stupid conversation to have because they mean universal values. That's what they say.
Yeah, when they say, oh, it's rule of law and it's tolerance, I'm like, everyone believes in that.
Yeah, who doesn't?
It's kind of silly. But if you're trying to say that this is a country, therefore it's a political community, and that's the basis of democratic life, I would agree with that. And I actually think there's lots of the left who don't buy into the idea that a nation state is a political community. If you don't believe that, by the way, go to loads of global south countries. Go to Iran and say, you're not a nation, you shouldn't have borders. They'll be like, what the hell are you talking about? We're a country, we're 5,000 years old. They're very proud of it, right? And that doesn't even mean that's not, you know, an Iranian leftist dissident, something in the protests in 2009 would say that. So that's the first thing. Do you believe that the country, the nation state is a political community or not? Now, I understand if you're an anarchist, you don't believe that, obviously. But it is central to the question of democratic self-government. Because if you're talking about government by the people, of the people, for the people, who are the people? If you're talking about self-government, who is the self? So this is key. And it feeds into questions of citizenship and who are the citizens. Now, I would say that, frankly, if you've lived in the country for, say, 10 years, I think you should have the right to vote. That's my view. Okay, and that will be a form of citizenship, and those are the kinds of conversations that we should be having. But I do think there's a part of the left that doesn't think that a nation state is a form of political community. I think that's ill-judged. Fundamentally, I think that's the basis of 20th century social democracy. In fact, is to accept that as a platform. Then, secondly, I do get a bit irritated when people deny white English people their heritage. Now,
well, what is that?
Well, quite. Not their heritage as white people, their heritage as English people. Their heritage as people who have a history, who have a language. And I think this is key. And I think it's a big mistake of liberal multiculturalism in the last, say, 3 or 4 decades. It's to code those people as white and not English. Let me give you an example. Aris Roussenos, who writes for Unheard, he said, look, he's very proud he's half Greek. He's very proud. He's basically Greek, right? His family is from Corfu. And of course, they were Venetian and then British. And like most sort of countries on the periphery, it's a bit like Northern Ireland and British. They're more British than the Brits. So Cypriots and Corfiots have these quite unique identities. He views himself as, I think, very strongly Corfiot Greek. And yet he's told by the British liberal state, in his view, he's white. And he's thinking, I've never identified as that before, actually. My dad would have been coded as non-white, actually, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And now you're saying I'm white. So I think this is really key. And I understand to an extent the upset that, say, somebody on the right might have. They're saying, well, you're half Iranian. You're allowed to be proud of your heritage as somebody who's half Iranian, right? My dad will say, for instance, if there's sanctions by the United States, we survived Genghis Khan. We survived, the Islamic conquests. We survived Alexander the Great. We can survive fucking Donald Trump. Now, he's very proud as an Iranian man, as a man of Iranian heritage. They will say, well, why can't we have that? Why can't I be proud of Alfred the Great and our language and Henry VIII? And to an extent...
Okay, but Henry VIII killed loads of his wives.
Quite.
Isn't it also the fault of the racists themselves who convene people around a racial category rather than a national category?
Quite. So when you say people saying, you should leave, I love this country, how many fucking trees can you name? No, but I'm being serious. You love this country so much. How many trees can you name? How many
Name a native bird.
Yes, these
other than
the osprey.
They're not being absolutely serious. These are the things that really matter: language, cuisine, landscape. These are the constitutive parts of national identity. And you're absolutely right. The far right doesn't care about that stuff. They care about whiteness.
No, but can I come in on this?
Please.
Because I feel really, really strongly about this. Because the thing I always get, right, from the far right is, why are you here if you hate us and you hate our people and you hate our culture? I was like, bitch, I never said I hated you, right? I hate you, the racist.
I love a Kaylee.
Right? I don't hate England. Like,
I'm there.
Like,
G&T, I'm in.
I actually do have beef with Kaylee's, but that's just because I don't like being told how to dance. I don't like being instructed how to dance. But that's a whole separate
You'd
thing.
never survive in
Oh
Jewish
my God, I would
communities.
not survive. But this thing about love of culture, love of place, love of specific local identities is that the people who've done the most damage to that are those who have been most in favor of corporate power, of just the of deindustrialization, of breaking up communities quite forcibly. And boomers embraced American culture, American TV, American music, American habits more than anybody else. So if you want to talk about a diluting of an English identity,
totally.
It's very much them. And it's not the same in different European countries. And I always think this whenever I go traveling in France or in Italy, and you go to a little village and you come across them when they're doing their specific village thing, right? And it's so specific, right? So there's this one place in the south of France where they've got this ball game and they play it off the wall of a church. And they say that they've got the Coupe du Monde, the World Cup, every year. And all the young people who live in Marseille and live in Paris or live in Berlin, they all come back every year. There is dancing, there's food, there is wine, there's loud music late into the night. You can't do that in a culture where you've got fucking nosy neighbours ringing up the council the minute it gets to 9 p.m, which is the culture that we have. Similarly, in Italy, where you've got such a strong sense of identity, again, remember travelling through and ended up in a conga line, around the village square, because they were celebrating the priest having been there for 50 years and they're having a big party. Now, these are exactly the things that have been destroyed not by immigration, but by capitalism and secularism, right? What are the things which preserve a sense of really, really specific local identity, right? It's not having total corporate domination of leisure and entertainment. Whereas we've welcomed that with open arms. We're like, you know what? Fuck it. We don't want our local thing anymore. We want a Hollywood Bowl. We did that to ourselves. It's having a local high street with local independently owned businesses. We've given that up. It's about having attendance of community organizations, whether they're religious like churches or whether they're working men's clubs or whether they're trade unions. Again, decimated those. And then we go, oh, it's the immigrants who've come here and weakened our culture. No, it's the embrace of a particular kind of capitalism at
It's
the
the
expense.
Claphamization of Britain.
It's turning everywhere into Clapham. Like you're completely right about that. And the thing that pisses me off is that when you tell me I hate England, I'm like, no, I love this shit. I love the fact that Denby Dale made a really, really, really big pie in the 80s and again in the millennium. And I want them to make a big pie again.
I've got a really solid example of exactly what you're talking about. So there's Wickham. I talk about Wickham quite a lot. But Wickham in Hampshire, it's a tiny village. It's part of Swallow Brubman's constituency. It's 5,000 people. They have, I think, the second largest medieval square in England. It's a car park, right? It's a car park. And I think they've had a horse fair every year since the 13th century of the traveller community. It's extraordinary.
Oh, is it Appleby?
No, this is a different one. This is a different one. Yeah, it's a different one in Hampshire, in Wickham. Spelled differently from the other Wickham, Wickham. Now, I talked about how it should be a square, and there are other squares, by the way, near there. You might go to Petersfield, also in Hampshire, very handsome square. Why can't it be like that right now?
Can squares be handsome?
Aaron loves the square.
I love a good
Can
square.
towers be fit?
People have it, and you do have some. You have like 3 very ancient pubs on their square, and people can drink outside, but they're basically stuffed between like a bus shelter, and it's just so sad. It could be so nice. And I said, like, this should be a square. If this was in Poland or in Italy or in France or Germany or basically literally any European country, there would not be car parking here. It would be a square. And then one of these far right accounts, just a moron. He just thinks he's really smart. He goes, well, if it was a square, then there would just be loads of immigrants milling around.
But that's the point,
Hold on. First of all, there are no immigrants there, okay? It's literally 99.9% white. That's the first thing. It's very white.
You're the brownest thing that's ever been there.
Secondly,
They take the Pantone thing out whenever you come.
It's impossible. I cannot imagine an Italian or a Spanish ultra-nationalist saying that. I won't restore this painting in the church from the 14th century. I won't restore that fountain. I won't look after that square. I won't maintain our historic heritage as a people. I'm talking about the Italian far right, right? The inheritors of fucking Mussolini. They would say, no, this is our patria, this is our fatherland, and this is the sort of material culture attached to it. We need to ensure that it survives and guarantee sort of beauty can be enjoyed. And you have this moron who thinks, by the way, he's their fellow traveller, saying, no, it needs to be a car park because people might enjoy it. And I think this really gets to the heart of what you're talking about, that we can talk about the far right, and of course this person is on the far right, but it's inflected through this very peculiar lens of like loving cars, weirdly. Like that is not a thing, by the way, and on the Italian far right, loving cars. They don't want to turn the Square of Siena, home of the Paleo, the horse race, hundreds of years old. They don't want to turn that into a car park because they actually care about their heritage, right? So this is a very peculiar way that we have these far right, or they think they're far right, sentiments being inflected through, American imperialism fundamentally, worship of the car in the 20th century, the demolition of cities and towns in this country with the arrival of the car.
Oh, what they did to Bradford city centre is unforgivable.
Crazy.
Unforgivable.
Crazy. And I think this is really, really key. Consumerism, like you say, corporate culture, being really a flunky of the United States, and secularism. These are the big things that have changed the parameters of why doesn't Derby look like Vicenza, right? By the way, that might sound crazy. Look at a photo of Derby from before the Second World War. Why do lots of these places not look great? It's nothing to do with immigrants, right? And maybe we'll talk about this more in a moment. You look at Blackpool, and by the way, as recently as the late or the mid-1980s, more people went to Blackpool than went to the whole of Greece for a holiday, right? That's what budget flights did to UK seaside resorts. And you go to Blackpool, now it's the HMO capital of the country, some of the highest antidepressant use. Doctors there refer to something called shit life syndrome in Blackpool. It's nothing to do with immigrants. Now, that's not an argument for more immigration or less immigration, but it's just a complete misunderstanding of the root causes of regional inequality, income deprivation, the built environment looking shit. And I think and I'll finish with this, because the right has been so implicated in so much of this, particularly since Thatcher, of course they can't say that. They're actually, we're responsible for loads of this. So of course immigration has to play a role. And I think actually there's the sunk cost fallacy there to such an extent where they may never actually admit their culpability.
So there was a point that Aaron made that I actually really wanted to throw to you because I thought that maybe you would disagree the most, which is this idea of the national culture. right? And the idea of the nation being a meaningful political unit, which you should embrace rather than trying to problematize out of existence. I mean, where do you stand on it?
Well, I think, it can be both, which is to say that I think there can be English traditions, like I've previously been to fantastic, like I said, Scottish, English, folk music, Irish, not that we
cheese rolling.
Yeah, cheese rolling. Fantastic.
Cheese rolling.
I love all of these little, trinkets of English heritage, and I think we should preserve them. We were talking about the Sash Window Task Force. Fantastic. Love it.
Aaron sincerely wants to set up a Sash Window Task Force, by the way. That's not just like a Novara in-joke. It's a thing he wants to do.
Give it 20 years.
Yeah. But I think what we also need to acknowledge is that quote unquote English culture or British culture is a composite of its history of empire. We drink tea because we colonized India. We have fish and chips because Portuguese merchants came to England. Our culture is not it wasn't, first of all, autochthonous. It didn't just come from the English soil. It came from
what a word.
It's a fantastic word. That's what you get from studying Geoffrey Hill poetry at university. Anyway, but it doesn't just come out of nowhere. But also, and we therefore need to understand deeply how much, quote unquote, any quote unquote nationalism is the product of migratory flows. It's not, immigration is not some modern problem caused by the war on terror, caused by climate breakdown. There have been Jews in this country for a millennium.
Can I quickly say one thing though? I'm not advocating nationalism. What I'm saying is we have to take serious. I know, but this, because they're separate things, right?
Yeah.
We have to take seriously the point that a nation is a political community.
Sure. Yeah. I would agree, but I think that has to be understood as something that's porous and that's something that's mutable, rather than what I think that ethnic nationalists want to do, which is to fix it at one moment in time. As I think Dan Hancock wrote something similar to this when he talks about proper bin-menism or real bin-menism.
Oh yeah, remember when bin men were odd?
Remember, exactly. And there's this idea that that at some point in time, Britishness stopped. And Britishness, we freeze frame, and that is the real Britishness. And everything that happens after that is a pollution, is a corruption, when actually it's the nationalism is a process of continual corruption. That doesn't mean I don't think we should pay attention to it. That doesn't mean I don't think we should try and define it. I just think that it's when it becomes something that is kind of so rigidly defined that anything that isn't, extreme royalism, being white, that's when it becomes not only false but also kind of contradictory.
Also, can I just say that having a fascination with Britain's royal history isn't the same as being a royalist? Because I am in my Wars of the Roses era.
Yeah, we know,
the three brothers of York. I love this shit. I'm gonna go to Conisbrough Castle soon. Do you know how excited I am about that?
Yeah,
so excited. And there's actually a kind of interesting division within my own house. So my husband is both white and from a working class background. He would never call himself white working class because he's I think that's a racist dog whistle, but he's both of those things. When I'm oh my God, English medieval history or oh, Shakespeare, doesn't this make you feel proud to be English? He's nah, not really. It's just, that's the thing. The place in which the conversation is happening is so different from the place where people live. And the place where people live is contradictory, it's nuanced, it can do both, and it doesn't have to be either or. And it just feels that in the world of politics, we're always trying to flatten it out. So we're trying to say, British values, it's a love of Shakespeare. And there's loads of white people don't fucking like Shakespeare, man. Where there is a lived organic reality of how people encounter themselves within the nation, how people encounter the national culture, which I just think is so much more rich and varied than whatever conversation we're having.
Well, if you look at, for instance, the Iranian nation, a really major part of it is across the shared fabric, across classes, is Persian poetry, right? And that's just, you would not be able to say, is everybody gonna, know a Milton rhyme or something? Of course they're not in the UK. It's not where it's at, like you say. One thing that I think, again, sort of right-wing critics of us might say, and they might criticize the left for, is that because it goes back to that point of nations as political communities and having to acknowledge the past, which obviously we should do. And they would say, well, there's other places, other countries also did awful things. I'll give you an example. Iran, Nader Shah, sack of Delhi. The Hindu Kush is literally, it means the Hindu killer, because so many people from Hindustan were coming back to Iran as slaves. So this idea that, for instance, global south countries haven't done awful things in the past, that's obvious nonsense. Genghis Khan, probably the biggest mass murderer in human history. Actually, I did a DNA test and I'm 1% East Asian.
I think everyone, statistically, every European's descended from Charlemagne and everyone else is descended from Genghis Khan. Yeah. I think it's a numbers game.
So I think that's a reasonable criticism of the left, in so much as I think some people on the left think it's only Europeans who did nasty stuff, and that's obviously not entirely true. Although what happens with regards to the transatlantic slave trade, etc., is very unique. But the idea that somehow countries in the global south are innocent is just simply not accurate. And so I take that point, but I think that's precisely why I think Britain is a healthier culture, is because we have the space to examine and investigate those things and say, actually, that's kind of fucked up. Whereas if you say even to a very literate, learned Iranian, the psychedelia and Nader Shah, what they did is kind of fucked up. They'd be like, well, no, he won. He was a great guy. No, but they would say that. It's very much where, say, somebody's celebrating, the Victorians would have been in this country like a century ago. So, and I think that's a sign of a really healthy culture. There's a great quote. A society is dead when the young no longer surprise you. And I think young people in this country still have a tremendous capacity to surprise the old. And they right now they're calling it woke politics. If you want a dead society that's going nowhere, that has no future, then okay, generate young people who don't surprise you anymore. But I don't think anybody wants that. And I think actually, let me finish on this. I don't think anybody wants that. And, I think being surprised by young people is a good thing. I'm sure I'll die in 40, 50 years' time and think young people are fucking morons. That's just literally how the world works. Well, I hope I have the presence of mind to know that I'm wrong. But,
your beautiful daughter standing over your bedside and your last words are, fuck you.
Well, if she wants more car parks, she's definitely right. But I think that is, again, something, and I'm not saying this is Englishness, but that capacity and that ability for self-reflection and self-critique, I think that's a really good thing. That should be celebrated.
So, final word of the entire show goes to you, Rivkah.
Oh, my God. Nationalism is good. Woo! I think these riots are a historic opportunity to have a conversation about what Britishness means and what Britain has become. Instead, and as you yourself have said, Ash, what we're getting is a technocratic, authoritarian crackdown on vigilantism, which is wrong. But a conversation clearly needs to be had here about, why are people so pissed off that they're setting fire to shit, that they're attacking their neighbors? Why have things got this bad? And the answer isn't just that they are racist. Yes, they are. But that being the sole answer and hate crime legislating them out of existence, it will just come back in another form. And I think this conversation that we're having about the Clathamization of the UK, the fact that there's no future for young people in this country, the fact that we're having kind of historic levels of economic stagnation, and the Labour Party has not got a plan to fix it. That is the problem. Happy people don't burn shit. And I think, as an abolitionist, I have a deep-seated feeling that people aren't just bad. And yes, they might have incredibly bigoted views and they might do incredibly bad things, but we have to understand the social causes behind this, and the blame doesn't just lie with people like Tommy Robinson, with people like Elon Musk even. And yeah, okay, we've had an interesting conversation about how social media disinformation and the kind of unchecked growth of these sort of platforms and oligarchs that have taken them over has a role to play. But I think ultimately, the people governing this country have an opportunity to do something historic in response to a historic outcry of the population, a small section of the population with whom actually quite a large section of the population agrees.
Rivkah Brown, Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining me today.